If you are just tuning in, welcome to Airpower Wins Wars. Christoph Burks here with you, and as usual, I'm joined by Justin Pike. Greater than hey there, greater than Justin. What's the latest from the Pacific Theater? Greater than apologies, I'm handling a couple of things. Setting up all the technology now. Laughter, oh, did you drop out? Looks like I've taken over the show. Justin, are you able to hear me? Greater than seems like you're back. Greater than have you been keeping the chat entertained while my connection decided to, laughter, fail? Greater than waiting to see if anyone would oh, now we've got our first comment. Greater than all right. This is me giving a soft launch of my plan to hijack the stream. Laughter, greater than taking you out while live on air. Laughter, greater than just bring in a team, pinpoint my location, then get rid of this guy. Greetings, everyone. Peter VS here. How's everyone's Sunday so far? To start off, Justin, what's happening in the PTO? Greater than honestly, not too much. Haven't even picked up an Airpower book lately. I'm reading something different, surprisingly. Greater than what's on your reading list. Greater than Grains of Conflict, which focuses on grain and food during the Second Sino-Japanese War. So it's also got quite a bit on Chinese logistical challenges and greater than yes, that's connected. It's been pretty fascinating. Greater than absolutely. Greater than logistics have driven the tempo of laughter, both past and future wars. Very relevant to laughter, the situation today. And I enjoyed Red Eyes in chat, coming in strong by declaring the P-48 Lightning is the greatest aircraft. As is the B-25. Slight contradiction there, but Justin, how do you feel about the P-38? Let's get all opinions on the table. Greater than honestly, I'm neutral. It certainly has greater than Justin apparently has strong views. Greater than secretly, I'm opinionated. My biases are showing. No really, that's one of those planes that's been somewhat mythologized. Some people seem to dislike it a lot more than seems warranted. I can't explain it, they have their reasons, but I haven't heard anyone actually detail them. They just don't like the P-38. Greater than I suppose some criticism always comes up about compressibility issues, correct? In the first P-38s, and yes, they say they rushed them into service and that created all sorts of problems at the time. Then there's always the assertion that it performed poorly in Europe and superbly in the PTO. But Justin, did it actually excel in the PTO? Greater than its reputation far outweighs its real record. Laughter. This is typical for many allied types in the Pacific. Most opinions are based on a single narrative. I don't think anyone really looked at the records. Oh, did I freeze up again? Greater than no, I'm still here. Just pretend, laughter, like I never left. The British Telecom is out to get me. Greater than as for the P-38 in the PTO, I'd say it did well, but not poorly at all. Still, its legend in the Pacific is so immense that reality can't possibly match expectations. That's the gist. It's a peculiarity with aircraft, because as you pointed out, reputations get glued onto a type, and then any discussion about it revolves around that history. And just because of that reputation, perhaps from a single action or event, it becomes the best thing ever. There are countless such cases. The Swordfish, for instance. It was a good carrier plane, yes, and could deliver a torpedo. After Taranto and the Bismarck, it became untouchable in criticism. The P-38, praised for being undemable by Japanese fighters, is thus placed on a pedestal. So, it becomes odd. The reverse happens, too. Some planes develop a negative image. Take the TBD Devastator, for example. Greater than but that perception comes from a single operation, overshadowing all the successes it had and, in many ways, it's being a victim of circumstances and tactics, with that background ignored. So yes, it's always interesting and challenging to make videos about these aircraft because of those reputations. Often, I first have to address why the popular opinion based on one operation is misleading before I can start the video itself. There you go. What are your thoughts on the Indian Air Force? Greater than to be honest. My current knowledge of the Indian Air Force is limited, so I'm not the person to ask, other than to say that, in terms of actual numbers, nearly every Air Force has shrunk since the end of the Cold War. Sure, there might be exceptions, namely countries who didn't possess an Air Force during that era, but obtained one later, but that's rare. The big question is whether the force they have today is sufficient for their needs. And for those aircraft, do their resources go deep enough? Are you gone again? Greater than Justin. Greater than if I vanish, it's your job to keep the chat entertained. Greater than I'll put on a show every time that happens. Greater than let me see. Oddly enough, I can't change my streaming resolution during the broadcast, even with all the money spent on this hardware. Your connection looks solid, though. Greater than yep. Greater than I can see that. Right, where were we? Laughter. So, chat, since Chris keeps disappearing, what are your strongest feelings about him? He definitely can't see them. Laughter. Regarding the Indian Air Force in that exact period, honestly, that's not something I know in detail. Looks like he might try a reset. So, I can't comment much further. I am somewhat aware of post-1945 developments, but not enough to give a concrete public stance. Greater than I think I'm back. Greater than seems like you're here. Oh, the resolution even looks real again. Greater than impressive. Greater than we'll see how things hold up. No idea what's wrong with the internet. Was fine earlier, now it's struggling. Good evening to AIM 17 France. So, if I drop in and out, you can always send complaints to British Telecom. This is not ideal. How much was the D4Y influenced by the Henko 118? Justin greater than well, honestly, offhand, I'm not thoroughly versed in the D4Y's development history, I'll admit. It's not an aircraft I've deeply researched. Yeah, greater than I do know that with several Japanese dive bombers like the D3A, there was quite a lot of German influence, even when not directly adopting German airframe components, but there was plenty of design cross-pollination. At least, that's what I recall, but I don't have a definitive answer. Unfortunately, it's rare for me to say so, laughter, but with the D4Y, that's an aspect I haven't read much about. So, greater than fair enough. Why did Japan strike the Philippines and the US? The Philippines weren't resource rich, so why expect an American exit, given US anti-war sentiment? Omar asks. Greater than that's a major question. Greater than it is. And admittedly, I haven't read that history in a while. From memory, there were proposals to bypass the Philippines to just attack Britain and take the Dutch East Indies for their resources, simply omitting the Philippines entirely. Based on what I recall, the Navy blocked this idea, since they viewed the Philippines as strategically positioned. They figured, can we operate assuming the US won't intervene while we attack various nations that are close diplomatic partners, and could eventually threaten our advance's flanks if left unoccupied? Plus, any move to seize new territory involved sailing past the Philippines. If they left it alone and America did enter the war, suddenly the entire archipelago, well positioned with enemy air and naval presence, could threaten any push forward. So, the Navy maintained, we must neutralize the American presence if we proceed with broader conflict. There's surely even more behind the rationale, but strategically, that's the justification. Even if the Philippines itself was not rich in resources or otherwise attractive to Japan. Yes, it's the critical point for operations in that theater, situated ideally, offering access to various islands, allowing you to potentially threaten movement east, west, or even north-south. Therefore, it's highly valuable for air power, even if inconvenient to occupy that land. I may have dropped off during your reply, so maybe you mentioned this already, but there's also the view that Japan saw the Philippines as a bargaining chip for later dealings with the US. Greater than their logic. by seizing the Philippines and soundly defeating the Americans, they might negotiate a settlement, perhaps return some or all of the Philippines as part of an agreement, and get the sanctions lifted. Many theories exist, and like you, I need to review the literature for the grand picture. But I believe your broader explanation, the operational perspective in the South Pacific, covers it, as does the bargaining chip potential. So, the connection is unreliable tonight. Let's try to push on, but if it keeps up, we may need to end the session early. Before more questions, a few announcements for the chat. You already know, Justin, but the Inside the Cockpit episode on the B-29 is about to release, which is fantastic. That was filmed at the New England Air Museum in Connecticut, just outside Hartford, for anyone in the U.S. nearby. Anyone within 3 or 4 hours drive is considered in the area, so do check out the New England Air Museum. It's genuinely a great facility. My internet appears down again. Am I back yet? Yes? No? I am. Laughter. Good to know. I was planning a sneak peek of the B-29 content, but the software seems to disallow sharing images. Another reason perhaps to consider a different platform in the future. Moving on, I'll post a poll in the YouTube chat while handing you a question, Justin, so you can keep the discussion going. Do you want an engine-related question, or should I pick from our other topics? Greater than I'll try tackling that. To my knowledge, the Japanese ultimately acquired a license to produce the DB601A engine. If I recall, the licensing agreement didn't include fuel injection, so Mitsubishi, I believe it was, had to develop that independently, which led to much of the reliability trouble with these engines. Not all, but some. I can't remember if this slowed production. I believe aircraft using DB601 derived engines rolled off the line, but reliability headaches continued for all the aircraft that used the engine throughout their time in service. The Ki-61 adopted a version of it, as did the D4Y. Eventually, in the D4Y case, they gave up on the engine, swapped it for a Japanese-designed radial power plant for better reliability. This switch did come at a cost. Hod Koshi remarked that, had the radial gone into the zero from the outset, that fighter would have seen a much better version introduced sooner, but at the time, the D4Y program had priority because of the reliability issues. With the zero holding up despite being outdated, the D4Y's problems took precedence. The Ki-61, meanwhile, kept using engines derived from the DB601 until the closing stages of the war, around which point the Ki-100 emerged, which proved highly capable but arrived far too late. So, that's the short version. Greater than well done. That was thorough. Chat. Justin's managed to keep everyone engaged and given me enough time to run a poll in the chat for the next episode's title. Please vote for your favorite, as this will help determine the winner. These days, picking the right video title and thumbnail is as crucial as making the content itself, since all of us are limited in our viewing time. You're most likely to watch what immediately grabs your interest. What methods did Luftwaffe pilots invent to counter the P-47 in 1943? What was their appraisal of its performance and flaws? Excellent question from Squish Face. Before answering, let me share the sourcing situation. Very few Luftwaffe records detailed enough to answer this survived, many were destroyed. We do have some pilot recollections. These suggest the P-47 earned considerable respect. Its main implication. Previously, German pilots could escape dogfights by either climbing or diving away. With the P-47, especially regarding diving away, that tactic became useless. The main advice for German pilots had long been to dive away from trouble, ideally into cloud cover, and this usually saved them, except now, the P-47's performance negated that escape. Climbing away might still help at select altitudes, and sometimes you could outdistance them just enough to make the P-47s turn back to avoid running out of fuel over hostile territory. However, German doctrine was to avoid fighter engagement. They'd keep smaller groups to distract escort fighters, but the real priority was eliminating bombers. So, the documentary record is almost entirely focused on how to position for bomber attacks, get in, make 1 or 2 passes, disengage, land, rearm, and try to attack again as the bombers withdrew. Luftwaffe thinking was to tie up the escorts but focus attacks on bombers. While the British refined the Spitfire throughout the conflict, why didn't Germany and Japan follow suit? Did the Spitfire's characteristics permit this? Actually, the Germans and Japanese did pursue this. For instance, the Germans continued updating the Bf-109, and arguably, the Japanese Navy upgraded the Zero, with the Hayabusa following for the Army. Greater than the question, as I see it, asks whether the Spitfire fundamentally stayed competitive through upgrades alone. Greater than did it, though? That's debatable. A simpler contrast, since it becomes somewhat more contentious discussing the 109, though I am no specialist, would be that my brief, straightforward opinion on the 109 is that it stands out as one of those excellent fighters with a notably lengthy series of upgrades. Its origins precede the Second World War, and across the greater part of the conflict, regular modifications kept it competitive. The Zero is arguably a more fascinating case in that it too was repeatedly improved during the war. I get frustrated when people assert it did not undergo any upgrades, which is often based on the fact they haven't actually looked into the matter. Quite often, their lack of knowledge serves as proof for them that the aircraft never evolved. In reality, the Zero saw numerous upgrades, with substantial weight and capability added over time. What ultimately restricted the Zero from achieving a particularly significant improvement, especially midway through the war around 1943, was the absence of a more powerful engine. They required a motor with markedly greater horsepower that also maintained reliability and was relatively compact to fit the airframe. It took considerable time to produce an adequate engine meeting all these requirements, although eventually, one was developed. I can't recall its precise designation, perhaps HA-1 something, but I know it was the same motor fitted to the D4Y3. The Zero later received this engine, resulting in the A6M8, which was ready for production by the war's end. Jiro Horikoshi commented that, with greater urgency, this new engine could have been installed on the Zero 2 years earlier or more, significantly boosting its capabilities. Yet I still doubt such an upgrade would have matched the newest clean sheet fighters of the period. One could also discuss how aircraft like the Spitfire and the 109, with their extraordinary service lives, were somewhat unrepresentative. When considering, for instance, the Wildcat's service lifespan essentially paralleled that of the Zero. While it remained in use throughout the conflict, it wasn't employed as the primary frontline fighter, didn't receive remarkable upgrades, and by 1943, much like the Zero, was quite clearly an outdated design. The crucial distinction, however, lay in the Americans having brand new designs available as the Wildcat shifted to secondary roles, whereas the Japanese replacement, the A7M, planned to succeed the A6M, was not ready. It's notable that the Japanese, upon the Zero's entry into service in 1940, actually drafted the specification for its successor to arrive 3 years later, knowing full well it would be needed by that point, but the replacement failed to materialize. This factor largely explains why the Zero, especially in 1944-45 when meeting next-generation adversaries, had to continue in service. That's where its reputation for obsolescence and inadequacy arose, representing a broader shortfall within Japanese industrial capabilities. Regarding the A7M, while I haven't studied it recently, I know serious engine difficulties were the primary cause for its absence. A higher power, reliable engine remained beyond reach for some time. The first A7M prototype actually failed, as its performance in many aspects was inferior even to the A6M5, which led to its cancellation until a suitable new engine became available. This underlines a critical flaw of Japanese aircraft design: the lack of engine development. Additionally, though I lack detailed knowledge of propeller design, various references cite this as another problem in the Japanese aircraft industry. This was relevant with the Zero as well, where improved performance from the integration of a new airscrew went into the initial design. For the Germans, regarding the 109, A major advantage was the ease of mass production. The 109 remains the most produced fighter aircraft ever. While there may have been some clever manipulation of accounting, swapping data cards as upgrades happened, the 109 cost about a third of a Spitfire to manufacture and could be completed nearly 3 times as quickly. Therefore, discontinuing such a design in favor of another required a genuinely superior replacement, which eventually manifested with the 262, where production became decentralized, enhancing efficiency and allowing even faster construction. A key difference between the 109 and 262 was that the 109 was specifically engineered for easy manufacturing. During Chris' brief disappearance due to internet issues, the discussion continued. Returning to the topic, for the 262 to replace the 109, an aircraft had to offer qualitatively clear improvements, justifying a switch for the Luftwaffe. Another question mentioned, if the Ju-87 was the Luftwaffe's sniper, why wasn't it fitted with long-range navigation equipment for targeting enemy aviation factories, and was that role handled by the Ju-88? Targeting aviation factories generally fell under the bomber unit's operational responsibilities. Luftwaffe doctrine held that bomber formations possessed adequate accuracy to destroy sizable targets like factories. Still, outside of the Battle of Britain and a few Eastern campaigns, little opportunity existed for such missions, and it probably wasn't worth the resources given likely losses. The Ju-88, being a bomber, could certainly also perform that role, and could possibly do so even more precisely when equipped for dive bombing, though there's no documentation I've found specifically assigning it to target aviation factories. The Ju-88 was seen as a next-gen bomber, faster, with roughly the same payload as the He-111, more modern, and with dive bombing or glide bombing for greater accuracy, particularly at sea, a key feature for the Ju-87. The Ju-87 could be fitted with wing drop tanks for extra range. In terms of anti-shipping in the Mediterranean or Atlantic, this was sufficient. Navigation aids, including radio direction finders, were added. In theory, with special crew training at least for each CAT's flight leader, these enhancements were available. The conversation drifted to digitization of archival documents, whether archives allow public access to researcher digitized records. Many archives are now making strides to digitize holdings and post them online, though older private digitizations often cannot be freely distributed, since it's the archive's job to provide public access. Within the context of published research, some materials can be included, but generally, archives restrict public distribution so that researchers are not allowed to copy thousands of documents and release them themselves. Ideally, private collections could establish online archives with use terms, which would benefit the field, since occasionally unique personal archives become accessible that significantly enhance historiography. Collectors of World War II German manuals and documents, especially those in Europe or the UK, were invited to contribute to digitization efforts. Justin commented that digitization has made significant progress in recent years. In his field, certain U.S. Navy intelligence files remain undigitized, while vast amounts of U.S. Army records are now available online. This wider access is crucial, especially for independent researchers or those living far from key archives with limited financial resources. Anything that becomes available online is a great advantage for such researchers. For Australians, early digitization was a strategic move given the country's remote location. Making records available online encourages scholarship on Australian experiences in the World Wars. Indeed, a doctoral thesis was written using digitized Australian documents. A viewer asked about identifying factories from the air. Several indicators exist. Major and even many mid-sized factories were already known pre-war. Countries like Britain and Germany maintained knowledge of each other's industrial sites, even if wartime production changes were sometimes unclear. Shadow industries' smaller, dispersed plants were underestimated, particularly by the Germans. High-altitude reconnaissance photography also assisted in identifying sites. Chris explained that aircraft factories are easy to spot from the air, as they typically have airfields nearby for flight testing and delivery. Beyond visual cues, Human intelligence provides crucial data through networks. Combined with aerial reconnaissance, this helps map out supply chains. The movement of components hints at which workshops manufacture items for the Air Force or Army, creating an extensive database of where everything is produced. Such data fed into the USAAF's decision-making when targeting key German industries. Early on, factories like ball bearing plants were picked as crucial links, but while attacks disrupted production, Germany often recovered quickly. The U.S. Air Force later claimed such campaigns were decisive, but research especially by the 1990s suggested that while strategic bombing contributed to undermining manufacturing and access to resources, it was not alone responsible for Germany's defeat. During another break, Chris mentioned the need to be more selective with video topics, as YouTube's algorithm has posed challenges for the channel. While Luftwaffe content remains enjoyable, topic selection now depends on both interest and audience demand. Lucio had inquired about a subject Chris hadn't researched further. The chat refreshed, and a question appeared regarding research that disputes the post-war Luftwaffe narrative of always being outnumbered. Chris observed that on paper, the Allies fielded more planes in both Europe and the Pacific, but this didn't always translate into tactical advantage in specific missions. During the Battle of Britain, RAF practice was to monitor Luftwaffe formations and dispatch smaller fighter groups to target select elements, ensuring tactical options and minimizing being outnumbered or intercepted by 109s, then disengaging efficiently. On defense over Germany, the Luftwaffe used similar tactics, vectoring fighter groups to divert escorts, bringing in additional units from different directions with precise timing to exploit gaps and strike through the defenses. Therefore, the significance of the American tactics lies in their deployment of multiple layers of fighter escort that advance beyond the bomber formation to proactively engage threats, particularly intercepting the Luftwaffe during ascent, remain with the bombers for consistent coverage, and trail behind to shield any aircraft separated from the main group. This strategy required splitting escorts into numerous smaller groups staggered at varying distances to counter the German interception methods. Even assigning 200 fighters in close proximity to the bombers could be insufficient. Luftwaffe 109s could initiate an intense engagement with 3 OP-51s and tie them down, after which FW-190s would exploit other sectors. The scale and complexity of these formations is remarkable and contrasts with the naval images often seen in film ships shown in tight groups when, in actuality, Pacific picket vessels were often many miles ahead to widen their defensive umbrella. Justin, you might have points to note on the Pacific theater. Yes, it's actually quite analogous. Allied air power steadily built up as the war continued. One factor that differentiated the Pacific from the ETO was that the Japanese were compelled to defend all their territory, whereas the Allies could choose their points of attack. As the Allied advance swept across the Pacific in 1944, this allowed them to amass notable numerical strength at chosen targets while the Japanese, by necessity, were stretched thin. Japanese planners tried to offset this by concentrating forces in select regions. The precise numbers involved during battles like Formosa in 1944 escape me, but it was a major Japanese commitment matched by formidable U.S. naval defenses. I am unsure which side had the edge on paper, though it's likely the Americans had a slight advantage. Tactically, this meant there were occasions where parity or even a favorable ratio for the Japanese occurred in localized clashes. So while they were usually outnumbered, it was not a universal condition. Another notable aspect perhaps worth exploring in detail in the future is the extent and effects of overclaiming, which was prevalent among the Japanese as well. A persistent historical question is to what degree senior Japanese officers accepted these inflated victory reports. The available evidence suggests a variable degree of belief. Reviewing Japanese wartime newsreels, such as those produced by NHK for propaganda, the prevailing narrative was of Japanese flyers repeatedly downing Allied planes in great numbers, especially American aircraft, yet the adversary appeared inexhaustible. This sense of confronting endless waves mirrors German perceptions of the Eastern Front but applied in Japanese wartime media to the Americans. While some of this was undoubtedly believed, the reality was that, despite occasional tactical successes, the Japanese were not as successful as their inflated reports indicated. On another note, you had shared insights regarding Japanese bombing sorties from Rabaul, highlighting that Allied, especially American and Commonwealth, defenders typically anticipated the arrival windows of Japanese raids, enabling them to prepare interceptors in advance and gauge the likely direction of attack. I find that operational aspect fascinating and plan to potentially author an in-depth study, perhaps not my next, as it's already underway, but at some point focusing on the actual implementation of Japanese air defense systems against sustained Allied bombing campaigns. There are thorough explanations of British and German air defense frameworks for specific periods, but a systematic comparison between, for example, Germany in 1943-44 and the British Dowding system in 1940, especially concerning operational realities, would be illuminating. Comments about Japanese fighter loss ratios also tie into this broader discussion. Indeed, it's an area that deserves attention and will likely be addressed in depth. For instance, what I often characterize as a historiographical mirage stemmed from reliance by Anglophone historians on English-language sources, leading to the entrenched belief that Japanese aircrew losses and kill-to-loss ratios were far worse than in reality. The lack of access to Japanese documentation resulted in over-reliance on Allied claims, which themselves were consistently overestimated. While Japanese records occasionally surface showing inflated numbers, English-language histories seldom account for these, outside of rare memoirs or monographs. Typically, the only time Japanese overclaiming is discussed is when it becomes an obvious exaggeration in the documents, such as claiming 10 Wildcats shot down when only one was lost. The opposite scenario, Allied overclaiming, is much more prevalent, since historians have generally referenced only accessible American records, where there were significant overstatements for various reasons. This trend ultimately skewed perceptions of effectiveness, suggesting U.S. air units fared better than reflected in reality. Now, detailed tabulations for the Guadalcanal campaign, to name one case, indicate nearly 1-to-1 exchanges in aircraft losses, a rate far closer than commonly believed through older Anglophone texts, though aircrew casualties were a separate and more complex matter. Recent scholarship has uncovered far more balanced outcomes, especially throughout the South Pacific Air Campaign, than English-language sources imply. As an example, a recent work cross-checked actual Japanese losses with American claims during the initial large-scale deployment of the P-38 in the South Pacific. The Americans lodged 84 kill claims, while Japanese records confirm only 14 actual losses. The historian Michael Claringbold, together with Peter Ingman, identified American overclaiming rates as extraordinarily high. One unit history for the Tainan Kokutai records both sides overclaiming at roughly 7.5 claimed kills for each real kill. Anglophone historiography has mostly relied on American tallies, and even when authors are aware these may be inflated, earlier generations simply could not verify actual numbers without access to Japanese files. For much of the South Pacific Air War, however, Japanese Navy records are invaluable and often better preserved than the Allied equivalents. Michael Claringbold notes some sections have more comprehensive Japanese materials, but language barriers and archival inaccessibility meant these sources were rarely used. Reliance on Western sources alone led to persistent underestimation of Japanese tactical performance and loss rates, which only more recent cross-verification using Japanese archives has begun to correct. Despite parity in tactical exchanges such as one-for-one aircraft losses, Japanese air units nevertheless lost the broader campaign. Guadalcanal, for example, demonstrated that such attrition was catastrophic for Japan and unsustainable against the greater American production capacity. Trading at even ratios meant certain defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Japanese overclaiming helped sustain internal morale but obscured the severity of losses. Admiral Yamamoto, as documented in a recovered statement, expressed beliefs that their Zeros were achieving as much as 10-to-1 or 5-to-1 kill ratios, a perception not supported by the actual outcomes. Similar rationalizations emerged at high command in the Luftwaffe, not just about bomber threats but tank kills on the Eastern Front, where exaggerated kill figures were accepted despite evidence that many were only temporary mission failures or non-permanent losses, and confirmation often remains elusive due to missing primary records. Addressing a related question, regarding Soviet Air Force interdiction missions, it is apparent that while the Luftwaffe favored this tactic more intensively, especially up to 1942-43, Soviet air units occasionally employed interdiction as part of breakthrough phases. Soviet manuals prescribed these operations to disrupt German army movements once offensives commenced and deeper penetrations were achieved. However, the preponderance of such missions was carried out by the Luftwaffe, especially in the early war years. An inquiry was also made into Luftwaffe fighter pilot training and large-scale pilot production during the 1944 crisis. The ideal process began with recruitment through youth aviation organizations, in which candidates were sorted for air or ground specialties. Ground roles required technical aptitude. Flying roles required both physical and cognitive skills, with some prior glider experience valued. After preliminary screening, typically at age 16 to 19, trainees progressed from basic trainers like the Bu-131, Tiger Moth equivalent, through about 80 flights before advancing to higher-powered intermediate types for another 80 flights. Those assigned to single-engine aircraft were sometimes viewed as less prestigious compared to multi-engine track pilots. Subsequent phases included frontline exposure with operational types, with new pilots generally completing under 200 flights before posting to a combat unit, though total flights before first combat could reach 250. This process accelerated in 1944 due to fuel shortages, which, more than manpower limitations, disrupted proper training progression. The resultant shift included development of twin-seat Bf-109 trainers, now featured in recent Inside the Cockpit segments. However, comprehensive data on total flight hours as elusive primary sources and published literature note flights rather than hours, complicating cross-study comparison. Most references lack footnotes, preventing precise verification of metrics. If I got sidetracked on flight durations, my apologies. Now, Justin, perhaps you could address remaining questions from the chat. I am comfortable with maintaining a regular event schedule, though Chris's multiple professional obligations and commitment to thoughtful, purposeful discussion occasionally impact timing. So far, we have succeeded in convening twice in a month, which is encouraging. Personally, I prefer organizing these events with a clear agenda, although today's unscripted approach has worked out, and I am open to further sessions, even solo editions, though I expect viewership would decrease substantially. Ultimately, the community will decide whose commentary they prefer, but the ongoing dialogue benefits from diverse perspectives regardless. Laughter? Well, that might hinge on whether or not the Americans are online at this moment, since I suspect there will be a Pacific theater of operations bias when all the Americans have woken up. Laughter, as opposed to a European theater focus. If you're based in Europe, let us know in the chat. Let's get some European laughter spirit here. Snorts, right. Going back through the chat again now. Someone is asking how much technical material, like blueprints and engine or airframe schematics, are still around. That really comes down to the nation and specific company involved. Some manufacturers were diligent about archiving those documents, while in other cases their control was removed entirely, as when, for example, something affected a storage facility, leading to destruction by fire or gradual loss over years, especially as businesses merged and changed ownership, resulting in unmarked boxes being tossed because no one knew their contents. Justin, you probably have insights here too about how much material companies disposed of post-Second World War. Greater than from what I know, at least, between the 1950s and the 90s, numerous companies and repositories overloaded with Second World War files simply could not store everything. Space and funding were lacking, so they were compelled to dispose of a lot of it. Some items survived, but a significant portion was likely lost entirely. Now the Americans are here in the chat. Canon photo. Where are the Europeans tonight? Truthfully, Europe is probably eating dinner, relaxing with a film, and gearing up for an early workday. So this timing suits Americans better, evidently. When it comes to training, were the final versions of the 109 or 190, given their increased power, more challenging to operate than their earlier iterations? As far as I know, that's an interesting point. I have not, to my recollection, encountered much literature on that topic. I believe the crucial factor is that pilots assigned to these aircraft often lacked substantial flying experience beforehand, as I mentioned previously. A pilot with 160 flights across 2 to 3 types and with individualized attention, typical of the early war, would find it much easier to adapt to such potent planes compared to a late war recruit with perhaps only 20 hours in a small 80 horsepower craft before suddenly being given a 109 producing 180 horsepower. Good luck with that. That, in my view, is probably the main consideration. Greetings from Sweden. Thoughts on a dispersed base doctrine, for example, using road bases? Actually, I think Sweden is an ideal case for such measures, and has implemented them exceptionally well. There are also videos on the channel about this. One covers what NATO should learn from Sweden. Despite the video's main focus on dispersal and the Gripen, it highlights a cultural adaptation potentially underpinning Sweden's strengths in this regard. There's a question on the PTO. Justin, I feel like I've been monopolizing the microphone. Your turn. If I recall correctly, Lucio asks, Japanese losses of about 40% of aircraft due to overwater navigation training or equipment issue. Greater than that statistic, as far as I remember, originates from Phillips O'Brien and is drawn from a USSB's interview, I believe. Greater than, however, I think that figure is inaccurate, far too high. From what I know, Navy ferry losses in the South Pacific specifically were said, for another USSB's interview, to be under 5%. Modern scholarship tends to mention major ferry losses as exceptional events. Greater than, and I should note, with so many volumes released now, it's hard to keep track, but there's an offhand comment in one that it's remarkable how seldom Japanese aircraft were lost transporting planes between Japan and the South Pacific. The most common difficulties were actually among Army units, which resolved this by having the Navy escort Army ferry flights, as Army pilots lacked adequate overwater navigation training. Offhand, I recall one major ferry loss incident. A sizable group of K-61s was lost engine failures, but I need to look up precise numbers. That's often cited as an extraordinary rather than average occurrence. Greater than, it's unclear if ferry losses increased dramatically towards war's end, though that's certainly possible and could relate to declining crew standards. I don't have direct numbers, but while 40% is conceivable in late stages, that statistic traces back to Phillips O'Brien in a single USSB's interview. I'd be curious for more aggregate data to confirm overall rates. Greater than, I think, again, we have to consider where the source stands alone. Greater than, but it's also possible that, at certain times and places, operational losses could match or even exceed combat losses during World War II. Most point to combat as the main loss factor, yet in reality, operational attrition could be shocking, in some regions very severe. To illustrate this broader trend, check my video from 2 years ago on the F-104 Starfighter, though covering the jet era. It uses data straight from the USAF on aircraft losses post-1950 up to now, including the F-45. Look at how many Sabres, F-86, were lost. The scale of Class A and B mishaps is enormous, thousands of airframes, with some Korean War overlap. Crash and fatality rates stayed disturbingly high outside of wartime as well. So, greater than, and if there's a broader insight, it's that with today's media focusing intently on peacetime aviation and naval accidents, it's worth remembering how much safer flying has become over decades. Recent USAF data for the first and last 10 years of F-15, F-16, and A-10 operation, including flight hours, shows drastically improved safety records. Aviation's ability to trace and reduce operational loss causes has gotten much better. So, greater than when high operational losses from World War II are used to single out a particular airplane. That seldom tells the full story. The underlying data may simply be more available for certain types. It would be enlightening to see a full breakdown by Air Force and period from 1939 to 1945 for operational losses where and when airframes and crews vanished. It truly was on a dreadful scale. Now, greater than why did Axis powers refrain from regularly rotating pilots off the line to rest or train others, as the Allies did? To explain, let's look at first examine occasions when the Allies didn't employ that approach greater than and explore the rationale. For instance, during the Battle of Britain, the RAF generally didn't recall pilots from the front. It kept a reserve, granted rest days when possible, but operational tempo demanded every available Hurricane or Spitfire pilot for combat. German forces, conversely, were on constant high tempo from the outset through to the end of the conflict, especially beyond 1941. Relentless deployment across all theaters became the main challenge for their training system, which could not build enough new skilled airmen, since new pilots were constantly sent to fight in every direction. Even the RAF only developed depth for rotation about 1943-44. As Bomber Command increased its offensive against Germany and North Africa remained relatively contained, allowing capability to amass in the background. America, for Europe at least, could generate a vast pilot pool by 1943-44 before deploying significant numbers overseas, which gave scope to rotate experienced crews home as instructors, share expertise, and fill support roles though, even there, evidence suggests some individuals served much longer than others. That's logical, as rising leaders would need to stay and become wing or group commanders. Completing a tour did not guarantee a return home. Many signed up again for another, and a significant number did so. Justin, anything you'd like to add about the PTO? Yes, the situation was largely similar for the Japanese. Greater than honestly, I still have many unresolved questions about Japanese aircrew policy and much to reread. Greater than Justin, maybe you should be the one to write that study. Greater than I'll get started on it. Laughter. Greater than thank you, that's just the answer I needed. Greater than there are works available Osmitoja, on Japanese Navy aviation, notably an Osprey series book, covers training regimes and their increasing pace. John Lindstrom has also written on it. My impression is that keeping pilots at the front was necessary just to maintain basic operational numbers. Unlike the Allies later, there was never enough surplus to justify pulling veterans to staff training or support posts away from the battlefront. Greater than the Japanese nearly always operated at a deficit. Some data Eugene Pinnick translated from the CENI shows the chronic gap between desired and actual personnel. Japan's forces rarely had enough people, especially ground crew and maintenance. The gap for maintenance and armament staff only worsened as the war progressed. Although aircrew numbers were expanded and often above target, yet the newly trained did not match the levels of those graduating in December 1941, for example. Laughter. So it was a constant struggle for them. I just remembered. The Germans trained their multi-engine pilot candidates on Ju-52s. This was good for learning transport flying, navigation, and working in complex crews since these aircraft hauled shipments across the region. New pilots gained experience from skilled instructors in such roles. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe also exposed Ju-52s and their crews to operational missions with high losses. Stalingrad comes to mind, but the first big loss was in 1940 during the Western Offensive, including airfield assaults and landings near Den Haag to seize the Dutch government and royalty. In those actions alone, Ju-52 losses reached about 50%, half the fleet destroyed in a matter of 2 days in the Netherlands. That also included seasoned pilots and instructors. It's hard to say exactly how many survived since some planes were destroyed on the ground by artillery and crew losses varied, but this depleted the next class of bomber trainees. A year later more were lost after rebuilding Ju-52 numbers. Further heavy casualties hit in the encirclement at Menzies Pocket, though not as severe as before. Then came Stalingrad, then Tunisia. With each event, Ju-52 lost